are the two storage devices being developed, that being the CD disk drive as well as also the USB flash drive. However, the floppy diskette was one that was somewhat synonymous as well here in Namibia in terms of if you went to either NUST or UNAM, and before NUST became or got its its current name right now, it was still Polytechnic of Namibia. In the same vein of those two institutions, for those of you who started off on that sort of like the computer skills training subject, that was at that stage known as Principles of Information Systems, which then became other, it had other remix names after that. You were sometimes required to walk around and obtain a floppy disk. If you guys can remember, the heartache, the headaches, the sort of like consternations that we all got from that little floppy disk. Yes, guys, I know a few of you will say, "Yo, Dwight, how old are you to talk? You'll be talking about floppy disks." Guys, come on. We were all exposed to this type of technology, and you can actually see the development of technology taking place in front of you. So, yes, I know what a floppy disk looks like. I had to use them. I made use of them. They were at one stage form part of my life as well. So, in essence, if we take a look at that, because digital media for today has now somewhat placed a major requirement on, somehow changing the storage devices as well. What you now see in mainstream everyday life, I say mainstream everyday life because we now all have to use it, is firstly an SD card, secondly a USB flash drive. Yes, it's known as a flash drive, guys. It's not known as it's not a USB stick. USB, the first three initials, stands for Universal Standard, I think it's passport or something like that. And that's just the point that from your USB, from your flash drive that connects into the PC. That's just the point's name because it uses that specific port. However, starting off with the floppy diskette and what it was in terms of the sense, a floppy disk or the floppy diskette, which was casually known or referred to as the floppy or the diskette, was a type of disk storage composed of a thin and flexible disk of magnetic storage. It's the same thin film of magnetic storage that you would find in a hard disk drive. A hard disk drive, guys, was the one before the currently developed solid state drive. And just to explain to you what a solid state drive is, solid state drives are usually indicated as SSD hard drives, and they are now sort of like the latest tech with regards to your physical PC. Because at some stages you had, and I know for those of you who used a lot of laptops or who who just primarily made use of laptops in terms of your everyday computer usage, you would sometimes see where your hard drive gives a little bit of issues. And that's after prolonged use, meaning for a long time. Now, the solid state drive, just to mention, guys, just to give you a little bit, this is the difference between the latest sort of like drive standards. A solid state drive is a storage device that uses integrated circuitry or integrated circuit assemblies to store the data persistently. Meaning, whereas in the floppy disk, which has the same technology that the conventional hard disk drive has, which is the magnetic film, it looks like a disk. It looks like a disk in its roundness. And what would happen? There's a little sort of like needle that writes onto the magnetic film. Now, with a floppy disk, you had basically a sort of like a portable or a sort of like a portable version of the hard disk drive. So you were walking around with this portable sort of like magnetic film, but here's the downside to it. It was big. It was prone to be damaged very easily because of its size, meaning that plastic frame of the hard. So if you accidentally if you had it in the back of your pocket and you accidentally sat on the floppy disk, it would break in two. Then it is completely useless because the diskette hard drive cannot sort of like what you call it. It won't be able to even take in a slightly damaged or even bent floppy disk for that matter. So it's one of the downsides to the floppy disk, but the floppy disk was one of it's sort of like the first instances of portable or very flexible but portable flash storage. You have to say flash storage because you can't say flash memory. Flash memory is something else. Now, flash storage in the sense is where the floppy diskettes, you know, like I mentioned, had the magnetic tape, or yeah, the magnetic film. And the only way you could write on a floppy disk is you had to put it in the PC. The same thing with your USB stick, the same thing with a CD disk or a DVD disk. You had to put it into the PC. Now, what if you compare it now to the current most popularly used flash storage devices, which is the SD card, as well as also the flash drive, the USB flash drive. Both of them, firstly, we have to establish this. Both of those two currently used standards or currently used storage formats have had major technological advances, meaning where the biggest floppy disk, and this is just to share with you guys how big a floppy disk is. The biggest floppy disk, or the biggest size that a floppy disk could take, was approximately let's put it at 200 meg, even slightly smaller, because we are talking about kilobytes here, or even just bytes, and bytes is very, very, very small. Now, in this specific sense, if we take a look at if we compare what this floppy disk could store and what your SD card and your USB flash drive can store right now, a USB flash drive can reach up to 32 gigs, even more now, 64 gig. That's now for the ones that are now the latest versions. The same also for the SD card, because you have to remember that the cell phones, your digital cameras, as well as also any other sort of like devices that require an SD card, have themselves increased their demand, their storage capacity demand, or their storage demand to that matter. Now, we have to understand, guys, if you measure what a floppy disk, in terms of how old it is, a floppy disk came on since 1971, was the first one that was invented by IBM, but since 1971. The USB flash drive came here since, I think it's 2000 something, 2005, 6, perhaps earlier. We have to understand it, perhaps earlier. But here's the thing: the largest, as I mentioned, the largest that a floppy diskette could store, meaning its capacity, was 200 megabytes. 200 megabytes, or even 240. They stretched it up to 240. 240 megabytes. That is small. That is peanuts storage capacity. Today, you've got a SD card that can reach up to 32 gig or 64 gig for that matter, depending on your storage requirements. The same also for your memories, for your USB flash drives, and that is also a very important thing, because you have to understand USB flash drives, for that matter, in their earliest forms, was also just sort of like a hit and run, a hit and miss scenario. Why do I say this? Because with the USB flash drives, in the first instances, guys, they started off with very small storage capacities. I still have a USB flash drive there at home that has 250 or 240 megabytes. That's its size. That is its size. Currently, right now, you can't even hope to be walking around with, you can't even be seen walking around with a USB flash drive that only takes 300 megabytes, because there in itself becomes a bit of a risk, because firstly, you have actually a bigger sort of like data or storage requirement for that matter. So the floppy diskettes, and just looking at its comparison sort of like to the solid state drive, as I mentioned, the solid state drive now makes use of integrated circuitry. The floppy disks began as far back as 1971, and it ended in 1999. That's just the year before the sort of like the turn of the current century, which is now the 21st century for that matter. And floppy disks were so common in the late 20th century culture that many electronic and software programs continue to use the save icon. You guys, have you guys ever seen on your Microsoft Word and on your any word processor, even if you're using Google Docs, the little save function indicates the floppy disk drive. It looks like the floppy disk drive. It's sort of like the popularity level in terms of to know what saving is. Because if you had to use any other symbol to save, or shortcut, or an icon to resemble that shortcut function to save, you would be doing something else, or you'd be confused in terms of what it looks like. Now, floppy disk drives still have some limited uses, especially with legacy industrial computer equipment, and they have been superseded by data storage methods, with much greater data storage capacity and data transfer speed. Now, guys, we have to understand with storage, it's not just about storing, or not just about having the biggest storage. It's also about the ability of storage, or transferring the same data that needs to be stored. It's about how fastly you can transfer it. That's another thing I'll touch on for later on in the Tech Eagle's discussion, for that matter, because data transfer speed is somewhat more important, and this has become one of the major discussions on the internet connection. And it's not something that is covered very easily, because people don't understand what happens in terms of when you have latency, or sort of like data transfer latency taking place. Just to indicate to you, latency has to do with a drop in performance or a drop in transfer speed. Now, the first commercially used floppy disks were developed in the 60s. I know I mentioned that the timeline indicates from 1971. But the first time they were sort of like, made or developed was in the 1960s. And they were 8 inches, meaning it was about 20 centimeters in size, the floppy disk. So 20 centimeters is a pretty big thing to be carrying around in diameter. And they also became commercially viable in 1971 as a component of IBM products. And then they were also sold separately starting in 1972 by Memorex and other companies. So you've got these aspects in terms of floppy disks that were like USB keys or USB flash drives, how they became popular in the same sense. Now, you have to understand, in terms of any storage capacity, I'll call it like the technology companies in the world, they continuously try to find new ways of saving or storing, or sort of like creating the latest tech trend or the latest tech hardware that will then sort of like generate a trend on its own. When we start off with the floppy disk in terms of its legacy of what I have left, for more than 20 years, the floppy disk was the primary external writable storage device that had been used. Most of its computing environments before the 1990s were non-networked, and the floppy disks were the primary means to transfer data between computers, which is a method known informally as sneakernet. Now, unlike hard drives or hard disks, floppy disks are handled and seen, and even a novice user can identify a floppy disk. However, because of these factors, a picture of a 3.5-inch floppy disk became an interface metaphor for saving data. Now, that's just part of the legacy. The floppy disk symbol is also still used by software and on user interface elements relating to the saving files, such as the release of the Microsoft Office 2019, even though the floppy disk or the physical floppy disks are largely obsolete now, making it sort of like a skeuomorph. However, we now progress into our second leg of today's discussion. And this one has to do with the USB flash drive, or as we call it, the USB diskette flash drive in that matter. But before we do that, we'll quickly step into a short ad break. From that ad break, we'll come right back, heading into our second part of today's discussion. Now, just to let you know as well, kindly, if you for any on-air discussions and talking about storage devices and here on today's Tech Eagle, you can come through on the studio number of 0832 401, and just remember that'll be happening from 11:30. On that matter, let's see each other after this short ad break.
To our valued listeners and all Namibians, we are living in unprecedented times which have seen some extraordinary steps being taken, some of which have suspended the most basic of human rights.
And this is because for the first time ever since our country won its independence, we have been hit by a dangerous virus, which is a threat to our livelihoods, the COVID-19.
The situation calls for us not to panic, but to work together and eradicate the spread of the virus. At Eagle FM, we urge you to always wash your hands with soap or use hand sanitizers,
limit or avoid travel, and respect our laws and obey authority.
We have the answer, and we will fight this the Namibian way. As Namibians, together as one Namibia, one nation. Let's stand together against COVID-19.
Now, coming back after that very short break right there, we step into our second round of today's discussion. And this one centering on the other external or very quick storage capacity, which is also temporary and flash. And this is the USB flash drive. Now, the USB flash drive, we have to understand, was also known as the thumb drive because it's somewhat as big as your thumb, depending on how big your memory sticks are or your flash or your USB sticks are. But it is sometimes known as the flash drive because of the size of your thumb, if you had to put it there. Now, the USB flash drive, remember guys, is still widely used. And digital media, in terms of what it has done, digital media has allowed, or the advancement in the one side of digital media has allowed for the advancement in terms of the physical hardware, in terms of storing that digital media on the other end. Sometimes even it's just, improvements of how the media can be stored and converted into sound, audio, or pictures. The flash drive on the other end allowed for greater greater ability to have flash storage or temporary storage in that matter. Because a lot of people realize, you can't just store everything on your PCs. Your PCs are susceptible to various external threats. These threats can be, firstly, cyber crime, and secondly, it can be physical damage or physical crime in that matter. What do I mean by this? Firstly, if you had to look at the advent of or the invention of antivirus, this has to do mostly with those of us that have internet connections at home. Internet connections have been one of the major ways in terms of which, firstly, viruses and various other malicious software can be transmitted to your PC and your laptop. This usually targets either your operating system, it targets your storage device, and it also targets your memory. Because it has to do with various, if it's malware, it has a malicious intent in terms of changing some of the operational properties of your computer. Second on that is also in terms of the physical threat that your PC can face in terms of storage or looking after the valuable data and content on your PC and laptop. Has to do with, let's for example say, the most obvious one, theft of the physical PC or the laptop. That firstly does put in does majorly compromise your information, your personal information, or even your business information for that matter, or let's say your employer's information if you had to store your data on your physical PC. And if things go wrong, people take your PC, they steal it, or they steal your laptop. That puts you in a very big inconvenience in that same sense. Now, you step on from that and you have to look at the advancements of flash drive memory or flash drive storage. Now, flash drive storage, i.e. also known as your USB flash drive or the thumb drive, has allowed people across the world to store vast amounts of data, vast amounts of information on something as big as your thumb. You can put it in your pocket. You can have it in your pocket, in your jeans pocket or your trouser pocket. You can have it. It is very small. You can hang it around your neck on a little lanyard, or you can have it in your bag. The thing is, it allows for you to just transport or transfer the data, or sort of like walk around with the data in that same sense, and leave the physical PC or the physical machine either at the office or either at home, where if something happens, then you can at least just be walking around with the data that you will need for later use. However, here's the thing: flash drives in the early days were not as 100% or as waterproof or as foolproof as we thought they were. You have to remember, guys, as technology companies themselves, they sort of like go through the same sort of like trial and error phase. Trial and error allows you to see what works, what doesn't work, what you need to drop and what you need to add, or you just have to see what formula or sort of like recipe is the best to follow, which then gives birth to other advancements or other sort of like technological developments that can either be a bonus or they can either sort of like start something new. Now, as the USB flash drive is the most commonly used storage capacity or temporary storage capacity, it includes a flash memory with an integrated USB interface. Remember that it's all about an integrated platform. It's the same as the solid state drive itself. The solid state drive, guys, is what you find either it's either now your latest versions of the external hard drive. You don't hear any mechanical sounds from them. Mechanical sounds you could only hear from the hard disk drives. They literally vibrated in your hand if you had to hold a hard disk drive, just like that, an external hard disk drive. However, with the external solid state hard disk drive or the solid state drives now, you don't even feel it vibrate. It doesn't even vibrate for that matter. Now, most of the USB keys or flash drives around the world that are in development and being found weigh less than 30 grams. That's how light it is. Now, since the first appearing back on the market in the late 2000s, as with virtually all other computer memory devices, storage capacities have risen while the prices have begun to drop. You might be asking, why would the prices drop as the storage capacity is increased? Well, it's all about the technology itself. If the technology is very scarce, the price is high. If the technology is very common, meaning you can find it everywhere, the price drops because everyone makes it, everyone has it, everyone has access to it, and everyone knows what it is. Now, as of March 2016, flash drives with anywhere from 8 to 256 gigabytes were frequently sold, while the 512 gigabyte and 1 terabyte version or units were less frequent. Yes, guys, you get a 1 terabyte USB key. I just don't know how much it would cost you, because a 1 terabyte external hard drive or external drive costs you about just below 1,000. So it'll be between the 500 to sort of like 800 Namibian dollars. If you go to 2 terabyte, it can be close to the 1,000 Namibian dollar mark, because they've even decreased on the size in terms of the 2 terabyte size. Now, as they are less frequent in terms of the USB flash drive, the flash drive, not the external hard drive, the flash drive. As of 2018, 2 terabyte flash drives were then the largest available in terms of storage capacity. So just 2 years later, if you can see the time frame, just 2 years later, they jumped from a terabyte to 2 terabyte in terms of that matter. Now, some of these USB flash drives allow for up to 1,000 write erase cycles, depending on the exact type of memory chip used, and are also thought to physically last between 10 and 100 years under normal circumstances, meaning shelf storage time. Now, there's one important thing to understand here out of that last excerpt that I just mentioned there to you, the write erase cycles. Now, like with most electronics around the world, it is known as a consumer durable electronic device. Second on to that is it is then also susceptible towards sometime breaking down. It will break down in the lifespan that you own that exact USB flash drive. What this means is inside the circuit or the chip or the integrated circuitry inside has a lifespan firstly of between 10 and 100 years. Second one of that is for it to be useful, it has 100,000 write erase cycles. Now 100,000 write erase cycles means how often you can write info on it and how often you can delete info from it. So what this means is every time you write, it takes off a cycle. Every time you delete, it takes off a cycle. And so the whole sort of like backwards, forwards scenario goes on, because a USB flash drive can only last for that long. It's not a forever device. But this is also to help you understand sort of like the dimensions, the aspects in terms of, is this something that can last forever? No, it cannot last forever. However, it does have the ability to be used for 100 years maximum. Or if it's not 100 years, you can equate that to 100,000 write erase cycles, meaning how many times you can put data on it and take data off. It's not just about copying, pasting. It's also about deleting what was there, because we have to understand this is temporary storage. This is not permanent storage. This is not your physical PC's storage capacity or storage space. This is what you carry in your hand, on your person, in a pocket somewhere, in your bag. You just go up and down as a student, as someone that works in a job that makes use of a lot of data and information that you have to work with. That is sort of like the requirements with that. Now, common uses of USB flash drives are predominantly for storage, supplementary backups, and then also transferring of computer files. Now, transference of computer files has been somewhat also had its own parallel development on one side. Why do I say parallel development? Because there have been the development of internet at home. So what does that mean? Also, it allows you to have various software applications online that you can access online through cloud services. So that transfer of data can take various forms. It can take various forms. You can either be someone at the office. Let's, for example, say you work at a bank and all the bank's computers are connected to one server or to a hub of servers. And what happens there is anything that you add on and anything that you take off, everyone can see that you did this. Because that is a form of transferring data, because you have to add it to a server. Everyone sees you added it to the server, and then when you access it, everyone can also see that you accessed it. Yes, guys, that's what happens if you have an intranet. It's not just about an external network. There's also an intranet, not just also an internet. Now, an intranet is more a closed-off network of PCs, just to explain to you. And this allows for everyone being connected to the same servers, having access to the same data components, and also you'll be able to see who does what changes on the data. However, the internet, like I mentioned, has allowed for various sort of like developments in terms of data transfer or transference of computer files, because first and foremost, computer file transferring also takes place if you just switch on your Google, or you access Google, you access your Gmail, and you send an email. That's all about also transference of data or transference of computer files. Because if you attach things like photos, documents, any other kinds of attachments to the email, you are actually transferring computer files, or you're transferring data. Even in that same sense, your computer, or even just by being connected to the internet, already has to send and receive packets of data. It's known as data packets or something in that same sense. It's because when the internet and your PC connect with each other and they establish a connection, data is into your PC, and your PC sends data in the other direction. This is then what you see as being connected, because you are then allowed to access various websites, various sort of like other platforms. If you're someone that plays games, it allows you to do so. If you're someone that loves watching your Netflix, it allows you to connect to Netflix in order to access the server of Netflix. And this is just some in that same vein in terms of how the data transference takes place, in a sense. Because data storage is not just all, data storage has a sort of like a one-part function in data transference or computer file transference. So in that sense, just to allow you to understand, when they speak about data transference or transference of computer files, it can be either you being connected to the internet, it can be either at the work setting where everyone is connected to a server, or it can either be like you physically copying data onto a flash drive, unplugging the flash drive, and then you walk to another PC to go plug the flash drive in somewhere else. So it has various instances, like I mentioned, as well as also data transference is a pretty wide term. So do not get confused if you think it's just to be isolated to putting it on a temporary storage device and then taking it somewhere else. It's not just about that. These days, people have found various forms. Even your WhatsApp is a form of data transference, or even just a platform for data transference, because you are sending data between one number and another number. It's two devices talking to each other. Or in some instances, if you have to understand it in another form, it's sort of like two users talking to each other. Now, if you had to compare the USB flash drive with its other sort of like earlier forms of flash storage, for example, comparing it to floppy disks or to CDs, they are the smallest. So not the smallest, but they are smaller, and they are one of the smallest because they are USB flash drives that are even smaller than your thumb. Yeah. Which is primarily, in most cases, either a SD card that you can see that is just plugged in, or if it's like with some fancy technology developers or hardware developers, they just like being fancy and they make these little very small, minute flash drives. I remember there was a Toshiba USB flash drive that I had. It was as thin, guys, it was paper thin. The thing was thin because you could see the chip was inserted into the frame, and you just had to stick it in, the chip facing down, end facing down with the name of the brand facing up, and you just insert it into the slot. Whereas, as you and I understand conventionally how you have to stick your USB flash drive in, it is the whole point. In that flash drive that I had, it was thin, man. It was a paper thin thing, and you just had to stick it in with the name of the company facing up and the chip facing down. That then meant you were connected, or you were able then to do your file transference and so on. So, in terms of that, the USB flash drive is one of the smallest sort of like temporary storage devices. It is, I'll say it is, because I've seen flash drives that are smaller and thinner than the SD card. Sometimes you have computers and PCs that don't have the very small SD card size, so you have to use the adapter, which is the big plastic sort of like connecting device. So you put the SD card in there, and then you plug it into a PC, or you plug it into sort of like a laptop or anything that has that SD card slot. So even there, your SD card can have a bigger frame as opposed to the floppy disk, or not the floppy disk, apologies, as opposed to the USB flash drive. Now, the USB flash drive, guys, so far is the most durable of all the of the past storage devices and even the current ones. Because here's the thing: if you make use of a lot of cloud services, what happens if you don't have internet for example, like that one day? One thing is you'll be experiencing one of the worst inconveniences in your life because your internet is down. Yet that means that you can't access your cloud services. And I know, for example, like for those of us who accidentally bought the sort of like the Microsoft, the Windows, not the Windows, but the Microsoft Office sort of like licenses. I thought it was, I could store the things on my PC, and I have to say that this was a pretty sort of like a almost like a very noob idea. Noob meaning newbie, because I thought, wow, I'm buying so I'm just buying the license. I download, then I can store them on my device. No, it actually meant everything gets stored on the cloud. So what happened that one day is, if you experience the inconvenience of not, renewing your cloud subscription, you lose the data that you placed on the Microsoft cloud. And that is one of the drawbacks. That is one of the drawbacks, unfortunately, because I thought like, wow, I could access all the Office or all the Microsoft Office, functionalities, continue the stuff, communicate properly with people and so on. Unfortunately not. And it's the same even if you think like, yay, then kudos for us that are, pro Google software, pro Google functions. Well, it's the same thing as well. With Google, if you don't have internet, you can't access those functions. You can't type, you can't continue typing. Like I make use of Google Documents a lot. Even the Google hard drive, you can't send or save or retrieve stuff if you don't have an internet function. So there is a major dependency on one or other sort of like infrastructure element. Taking a look then at the other, in terms of if you have to compare it now to sort of like for those who don't like walking around with memory sticks or with flash drives or with USB flash drives or SD cards, you then get the guys that love sending things via file transfer or file transfer protocols or file transfer sites or file transfer service providers. These guys are Dropbox, number one, WeTransfer, number two. You have MegaShare, you have MegaFile, there was another one, Rapid, yes, Rapid, I think it's Rapid Alligator or Rapid Gator. These are various sort of like file transferring service providers. With all of them that I mentioned, you actually have to pay if you want the premium sort of like thing, because if you go in the normal free function with some of them, it takes a lot longer to transfer the file. So think about it as in the sense of almost like a torrent service provider. For those of us who remember what torrents are, torrents used to be something that Pirate Bay used to run on a lot. The unfortunate thing is with these file sharing guys, if you have the free one, they actively frustrate you and inconvenience you. So if you even think, yay, I've got the internet sorted, but I want to completely make use of file transference platforms, you'll be frustrating other people, because let's for example say they don't have the money to to own or have a subscription every month or every year. So that also then is a negative. And here's the thing, with the file transference platforms, if you send a file to someone, the file expires or the link expires. Even if you use your Google Docs platform, the link expires. So it has a expiration date attached to that link. So if you send the link for someone to download a file that you want to transfer to them, because it works in the same sense as torrents, because you're downloading from someone else instead of someone emailing you or sending you the file, or putting it on a USB stick and giving it to you to to copy from. File transference is one of the more convenient ways, but it's also one of the sort of like most inconvenient ways to do it, because if people don't have internet, or your internet plan is not that big or not sufficient enough, and I'm sending someone a very big file, it's a major inconvenience, because first and foremost, if you have to download the file, you are taking the amount of how big the file is from your data. Yes, the amount of how big that file is equivalent to how much data is subtracted from your internet plan. So people who love downloading movies, if you download a 400 or 500 megabyte file, it's a 400 or 500 megabyte file that is taken from your internet or from your data packet with your service provider. That then takes us into another discussion. And this is still staying on the sort of like the USB flash drive in that same sense. Now, USB flash drives use the USB mass storage device class standard. Now, this is a standard which consists of a set of computing communications protocols, specifically for USB device class, and is defined by the USB Implementers Forum that makes a USB device accessible to host a computing device and enables file transfers between the host and the USB storage device. Now, this is supported natively by modern operating systems. So, if you thought that a storage device, a portable or a temporary storage device could just be developed just like that, out of the blue, out of thin air, for no reason, and be imposed on computing hardware or standards, it has to go through sort of like a standards review. Second on to that is also it has to be adopted by the major operating systems in the world. And the major operating systems are, firstly, Windows, meaning Microsoft, Linux, which is open to everyone. Then onto that is the Apple operating software for their computers. Then you also have sort of like the other ones used on industrial platforms, where you also find Windows, and in some cases also various other formats. It just depends. Now, in that same sense, those same operating software developers, meaning those companies behind those OSs, they are the guys that say, sure, will this new standard or will this new portable standard sort of somewhat have a negative reaction towards the operating software or the operating system that they make use of or have rolled out. And this is some of the things that have to be somewhat taken into consideration, because as I mentioned, guys, the big guys are Windows, Linux, Macintosh OS, and the Unix-like systems. Unix-like systems are other systems. They're used mostly on the industrial level. And then you also get BIOS systems, which have to to make use of that, or that are all involved in this computing platform for computers. Now, USB drives with the USB 2.0 support can store more data and transfer faster than much larger optical disk drives like the CD-RW and the DVD-RW standards or drives, and they can be read by many other systems such as the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, and as well as also the DVD players and automobile entertainment systems, as well as also other or a host of a number of handheld devices such as your smartphones, tablet computers. And this is also, although the electronically similar SD card is a better suited one for these devices due to their standardized form factor, which is the size, which allows it to be housed inside a device without protruding on the outside. Now, we have to understand, guys, that the flash drive essentially is still currently in use, and it is one of the sort of like most widely used file storage platforms. The aspect is also that you know there are additional components that can come on, for example, like LEDs in terms of to indicate whether your device is connected or not. Write protect switches. You find it sometimes on some USB drives. It is one of the most annoying standards and the most annoying things to find on a USB flash drive. And then it's also just in terms of the size and the packaging. It depends on who the manufacturer is. They can make a USB stick in any size. uh, I'm not talking about the storage size. I'm talking about the size, its physical size, the casing, or that sort of like what you see there, that plastic mold that forms part of the casing. um, as mentioned, the aspect of also the note of counterfeit products with regards to USB flash drives. There has been, at one stage, I remember from being a student, there's been at one stage a sort of like, it was almost like considering it to be fake, because some USB sticks or USB flash drives, when I was still, like a full-time student on university, there was a notion of some classmates that had the notion of fake USB sticks. I say fake because you can plug them in, you can plug them in, but the size and also the durability of the storage device was the two components that brought the largest sort of like criticism, as well as also most that caused the most inconvenience. Why do I say this? Well, at one stage, a lot of the colleagues had like these, when you're a student, you have a major requirement to own a memory stick or to own a flash drive. It is one of the most essential things as a student today on university. You must own a USB stick. Now, at some stage, there was a whole bunch of classmates that got like, free USBs from either from friends or family members that worked at companies, and then they got like these freebies that like stuff like notoriety gifts, that like a pen, a T-shirt, a cap, a cup, and then part of it sometimes is like a lanyard with a USB stick. Now those USB sticks, guys, and this is just a fair warning that I'm assisting you with. You have to watch out for those USB sticks specifically. I know back then those USB sticks were like, they were one of the sort of like the most divine gifts you can have as a student, because back then a USB stick, if you wanted a good one, you needed like an 8 gig or at least a 16 gig thing. And 8 gig, if you had an 8 gig one, yeah, you had the capability, but the cost, how much it cost you, was one of those other things that was sort of like a drawback. So everyone usually walked around with either 2 gig or 4 gig, or the other odd number being the 6 gig itself. Now, the dumb thing is that those that were company branded USB sticks had a notion, or a sort of like, they were popular for like bombing out on you. What I mean by bombing out, they would just stop working suddenly one day, or they would get lost, or they would get damaged, or at one stage, as I knew, or what I heard of, is like there was this thing that if you had your USB stick next to your cell phone would sort of like wipe your USB stick completely. That has changed now with the development in technologies now, because you can now hold your USB stick next to your cell phone and it won't get wiped. However, that then brings us up to the end of today's program here on your number one talk radio station of Eagle FM. And this has been the Tech Eagle on this lovely Monday, the 14th of February, which is also, unfortunately for you guys out there, the men that have to say Happy Valentine to those that are special ones in your life. Guys, I know, just say Happy Valentine. Just do what I did. I just said Happy Valentine. But nonetheless, let's see each other again later today on the Home Run program. And as well as also, let's see each other again tomorrow on the Tech Eagle for the Tuesday session to come on tomorrow. Stay tuned, as my colleague Sally will step in just shortly after the short ad break for the brand conversation, and she will take you up to the top of 1 o'clock where you will then meet with Andrew and his team for the Daily Bulletin on the Radar.